Okay, good evening, everybody. My name, for those of you who don't know, is Mark Pennington. I'm head of the Department of Political Economy and also the director of the Centre for the Study of Governance and Society, which is hosting the event this evening. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge our support to the King's Worldwide Partnership Fund, which is sponsoring this evening's event. So we're delighted to have with us this evening Professor Larry Bartels, who's Chair of Public Policy and Social Science at Vanderbilt University. Larry has a very distinguished career in which he's made a number of fundamental contributions to understanding issues of accountability and non-accountability in governance institutions. In works such as Unequal Democracy and Democracy for Realists, he's addressed one of the fundamental questions of the day, that of the relationship between economic inequality and political inequality. His work's of particular interest to the research centre here because it engages in questions of what some people call non-ideal analysis, looking at how institutions work with all of their flaws rather than analysing them in some idealised sense. So we're delighted to have Larry with us here to give this talk this evening, which is entitled Political Inequality in Affluent Democracies. Please give a warm King's welcome to Professor Larry Bartels.
Thank you all for being here and for having me. It's a real pleasure. I told somebody earlier that I have an 18th century print of St. Mary's on my dining room wall, and so I found my way over here without any trouble. I want to talk today about a project that's ongoing, not yet been published, but I've been working on it off and on for several years, and so I'm interested especially in getting your ideas about additional directions to pursue. The starting point really is a quotation from the eminent political scientist Robert Dahl, who wrote almost 50 years ago now, "I assume that a key characteristic of a democracy is the continued responsiveness of the government to the preferences of its citizens considered as political equals." And so what I want to do essentially is to test that proposition in contemporary democracies to see to what extent citizens' preferences actually affect public policy. It's kind of curious that political scientists have been interested in the issue of inequality for centuries, but for the most part, until recently, haven't really attempted to measure in any very systematic way the actual political influence of ordinary citizens. There's a huge literature, for example, on political participation and inequalities in political participation, which is motivated more or less explicitly by the idea that political participation will somehow translate into political influence. And so if we see that some kinds of people are more participatory than others, that we imagine that that would translate into giving them greater effective political power. But the political power itself really hasn't been tested in any very direct way until recently because of difficulties of measurement and analysis. And so what I wanted to do is to use policy responsiveness insofar as we can observe it as a test of political equality or inequality. Mostly this has been done so far in the United States, and so I want to focus on a couple examples of analyses that have attempted to measure disparities in political influence. One is this book by my former colleague Martin Gilens, who's now at the UCLA Policy School, Affluence and Influence. Gilens writes, "Responsiveness is strongly tilted toward the most affluent citizens. Indeed, under most circumstances, the preferences of the vast majority of Americans appear to have essentially no impact on which policies the government does or doesn't adopt." And here's a kind of summary of Gilens' most important statistical evidence. What he did was to gather information from 1,800 surveys that asked people about policy preferences. So with respect to some particular policy issue, whether they favored or opposed a policy change. And then in each of those instances tabulated the preferences of people in different parts of the income distribution. And so on the left here, the picture shows you the impact on the probability that a policy change will actually be adopted of variations in the preferences of people at the 10th percentile near the bottom of the income distribution and the 90th percentile near the top of the income distribution. So in each of these instances, the 1800 policy questions, he had research assistants go out and see whether the policy change actually had been adopted over the 4 years following the date of the survey. So you can see that the probabilities are never much higher than about 0.5. So there's overall a kind of status quo bias. Most policy changes don't actually occur. But if you look at the relationship between preferences and the probability of these policy changes, you see that there's a pretty strong relationship between the preferences of people at the 90th percentile and the probability of an actual policy change, and virtually no relationship at all between the preferences of people at the bottom of the income distribution and the probability of a policy change. So this is a really striking disparity in the apparent responsiveness of the system to these two groups of people. Even more surprisingly, in the panel on the right is a similar kind of comparison, looking at the preferences of people near the top of the income distribution and the preferences of people in the middle of the income distribution. You probably all heard about the median voter theorem. If it was applying in this situation, we'd expect policy to be minutely sensitive to the preferences of people in the middle of the income distribution. You can see that in the cases, the subset of these policy issues where their preferences disagree with the preferences of affluent citizens, there's virtually no relationship between their preferences and policy outcomes, whereas there's still a pretty steep relationship between the preferences of people at the top and the probability that a policy will actually be enacted. Here's a parallel kind of analysis from my own work using a very different research design, looking at the behavior of individual US senators. So the senators are elected from states, and what I've done is to tabulate the preferences of their constituents in their own states, dividing them into three groups: people in the upper, middle, and lower thirds of the income distribution, and then look to see to what extent the roll call votes cast by these senators correspond to or are influenced by the preferences of citizens in each of these three groups. There are two versions of this analysis, one from the first edition of my book, which was published in 2008 using data from the early 1990s, and you see the results there on the left. The estimated impact of the preferences of people in the top third of the income distribution, the solid green bar, pretty substantial. In the middle third, unlike Gillen's, I find some responsiveness to the preferences of middle income people in the votes cast by these senators. And you could see if it was there, but it isn't, the estimated impact of people's in the bottom third of the income distribution is actually zero. Their policy preferences have no discernible impact on the behavior of their elected officials. And then for the second edition of my book, which was published in 2016, some updated analysis using bigger surveys from the Obama administration, and finding, if anything, an even more exaggerated disparity in apparent responsiveness, with a good deal of apparent responsiveness to the preferences of people in the upper third of the income distribution, and again, virtually none to the preferences of people in the bottom of the income distribution. Now, these analyses have received a good deal of attention in the literature on American politics, and there's been a lot of speculation regarding why we see them. And I have to emphasize, it really is just speculation at this point. We really don't, I think, have a very good understanding of the basis of these disparities in responsiveness. But insofar as Americanists have speculated, they focus mostly on aspects of the American political system that are quite specific. Citizens United is the recent Supreme Court decision that made it easier for rich people to funnel campaign money into the political system. People have focused on that, or more generally on the role of money in US politics, which operates rather differently from most other advanced democracies. On inequalities in voter turnout, which are more exaggerated in the US than in most other places. The relative weakness of labor unions, specific political institutions, aspects of American political culture, or simply the fact of greater economic inequality in the US than in most other affluent democracies. But the striking thing to me here is that all of these speculations about why the data looks so depressing for the US have to do with features that are pretty specific to the US. And if those are the right explanations, it occurred to me at some point, we ought to be able to go look at other places that don't have these institutions or this political culture or this political economy and find that the patterns of responsiveness are quite different. And so that's really the logic that motivates the analysis that I'm going to talk about today. If these features of American political institutions and culture are to blame, we should observe much more political equality in other democratic systems lacking those features. And so I want to know whether the US is indeed an anomaly or whether there are actually substantial disparities in responsiveness endemic in affluent democracies. And so here's what the basis for my analysis is going to look like. I have data from the mid-1980s through the mid-2000s. Hope to be getting another round of data fairly soon. And you can see the list of countries included in the analysis. Basically, they're OECD countries. Not every one of them in every one of these time periods, because these surveys were conducted more or less frequently in different places with somewhat different timing. But this is essentially the set of countries that I'm going to be analyzing and talking about. And here's the substantive focus of my analysis, or at least the part of it that I'm going to talk about today, support for social spending. In all of these countries, there were surveys in which people were asked, listed below are various areas of government spending. Please show whether you would like to see more or less government spending in each area. And there's some effort here to get them to think about trade-offs by saying, if you say much more, it might require a tax increase to pay for it. And here are the 8 specific policy areas that these people were asked about. I'm going to focus on the 4 on the left: health, pensions, education, and unemployment benefits. Here's what the data look like for one country in the most recent survey, the United States. People could say that they wanted to spend much more on education, spend more, spend the same as now, spend less, or spend much less. And what you can see if you look at the proportions in these various categories is that there's a huge skew toward people wanting more spending on education and health and old age pensions, somewhat less on unemployment benefits. But even in that case, the overall sentiment is for increases in spending. And I'll be talking about the average of those 4. So the social spending average in the rightmost column is an indicator of the general level of preference for increased social spending in the US in 2006. But the US is not unusual in this respect. Here's what the net demand for social spending looks like in all of the other countries included in my analysis. And you can see that the US falls kind of in the middle of the pack. There's substantial unmet demand for social spending, at least by this measure, in all of these affluent democracies. So we might wonder why that is. One story that's often told is that there might be a disparity in the short term between what citizens want and what their policymakers give them. But as policymakers recognize citizens' preferences, they bring policy into alignment with preferences, and that these disparities are short-term in nature. That turns out not to be the case either. Here's what the data look like for the 4 countries that were included in all 4 waves of this survey. I'm showing you here the net demand for increased spending in each of the 4 countries. And you can see that in most cases, actually, the gap between what citizens say they want and what they're getting has actually increased over time rather than decreasing. The one exception is actually Britain, where the Labour government came in and began to spend more on a lot of these social programs. And so the unmet demand for spending actually declined between the mid-1990s and the mid-2000s in that instance. But there's certainly no evidence overall that these disparities are temporary. That seems at odds with the literature, such as it is, on policy responsiveness. I just have 2 examples here, kind of summary quotations from 2 of the most prominent books on the welfare state. Sorokin and Vlasian's Degrees of Democracy, where they write, budgetary policy responds to public preferences. Mass media, interest groups, and policy advocates surely matter as well, but the people ultimately decide. and Brooks and Manz's book, Why Welfare States Persist, mass policy preferences are a powerful factor behind welfare state output. Low levels of public support for the welfare state are a central reason behind the market-oriented character of the American political economy. Well, both of these works deal with essentially the same time period and set of countries that I'm going to be talking about here, and sometimes also with the same data. Here's one way to think about why they might come to the conclusion that they did. Here's the relationship between the net public demand for social spending, as I've described it so far, in each of the country years that I have available for my analysis, and the actual change in social spending over the 2 years following the survey in each country. And the solid line shows you what the summary regression relationship looks like between the public's demand for increased spending and actually getting increased spending. It's a pretty substantial relationship. Moreover, it looks reassuring if you look at the 0 point. You can see that the regression line goes almost exactly through it, which is to say that if citizens were satisfied with the level of spending that they were getting, the prediction would be that there would be no increase or decrease in real spending per capita in each of these areas. So that sounds like a kind of reassuring picture of the relationship between public opinion and policy outcomes. One reason you might begin to cast doubt on it, though, is to look at the diagonal line, which is much less steep. That line summarizes what the analysis looks like if you just take out the most obvious two outliers up at the far right there. It turns out that they're driving much of the relationship, and once you leave them out of the analysis, the overall relationship looks much weaker. There are also some other attitudes that citizens have that might be relevant to thinking about why they get the policy outcomes that they do. And I want to focus on a couple of them here. One is their overall level of support or opposition to government spending as a general matter. The same surveys that I just described include a question: here are some things the government might do for the economy. Please show which actions you are in favor of and which you are against. And one of the actions that's listed is cuts in government spending. It may or may not surprise you to hear that the very same citizens who a minute and a half earlier in the survey expressed that they wanted to spend much more on education and pensions and healthcare, when they get to this question, are very enthusiastic about cutting overall levels of government spending. So they want to cut spending, but increase spending on all the things that government mostly spends money on. There are also in this survey and in other surveys some broader questions tapping what I'll call support for the welfare state. Generally kind of broad questions about whether the government ought to be involved in providing jobs and taking responsibility to ensure that everyone is provided for. So you might think that even if citizens don't have meaningful preferences about the specific level of spending on a specific social program, they at least might express more or less enthusiasm for the welfare state in general, and that enthusiasm would contribute to policymakers' decisions to spend more or spend less. Well, here are what the statistical relationships look like between the preferences of citizens for increased social spending and the actual changes in spending over the subsequent 2 years. I'm not going to go through these analyses in a lot of detail, but first to show you in the first column that there's a pretty substantial positive impact of spending preferences on spending, allowing for several of the other factors that you might expect policymakers to take into account, like how many elderly people there are and how rich the society is and whether GDP and unemployment are growing over the short term and so on. That relationship becomes so much weaker once we also take account of budget cutting preferences, and it's weaker when we focus on this general measure of welfare state support rather than on specific spending preferences. And just to show you the set of analyses on the left here, includes about 50 country years from 25 countries, and the rightmost column, since we have more data for welfare state support than for the specific social spending measures includes 106 observations from 30 different countries. So there seems to be some limited evidence of responsiveness to public opinion. Now I want to turn to the main focus of my analysis, which is about disparities in responsiveness. And the way I'm going to tackle that is to do a similar kind of statistical analysis, but to include here not just the overall level of public support for social spending or for the welfare state, but rather the specific preferences of people at the top and bottom of the income distribution. If people are interested, I can say more about exactly how I do that. But basically what I'm going to have is a measure of the preferences of people at the top of the income distribution and a measure of the preferences of people at the bottom of the income distribution. And you can think of this as capturing the views of people in between as being a kind of weighted average of people at the top and people at the bottom. So people in the middle of the income distribution, their preferences would fall halfway in between given this simplification that I'm implying here. And here's what the relationship between high and low income support for social spending actually looks like. This is the net demand for social spending on the horizontal axis for people at the bottom of the income distribution and on the vertical axis for people at the top of the income distribution. You can see that almost all, though not quite all, of the observations fall below the 45-degree line, which is just to say that low-income people are generally more supportive of increased spending in all these areas than high-income people are. That's not too surprising. Here's the similar kind of analysis for the measure of support for the welfare state, the more general measure. Here, an even clearer disparity in preferences between people at the top and people at the bottom, with poorer people generally expressing a good deal more support for the welfare state. This may have to do in part with the fact that one of these specific questions about the welfare state focuses on the government reducing income differences between rich and poor people. And so in that case, it may be especially unsurprising that rich people tend to be less enthusiastic about that proposition than poor people do. But even in the case of the separate measure of support for the welfare state from the World Values Survey and European Values Survey, which don't include that wording about reducing income differences, you see that by and large, almost everywhere and at almost all times, low-income people are more supportive of the welfare state than high-income people are. So there's at least in principle some possibility that biases and responsiveness to the preferences of people at the top and bottom will translate into different policies than we would have gotten if responsiveness was more egalitarian. Again, turning to simple regression analyses, all of these will include the same control variables that I showed you before. Some of them where possible will include country fixed effects as well. But the difference is that now I'm going to distinguish between opinions of people at the top of the income distribution, which I'll call high income preferences, and people at the bottom of the distribution, which I'll call low income preferences. Again, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about the specifications or the evidence, but just to show you a kind of summary. In both these cases, the first two, I don't know if you can see the mouse, yeah. The first two regression analyses, there's a strong positive relationship between the preferences of high-income people and actual policy shifts, and virtually none at all between the preferences of low-income people. Similarly, if we include the preference for budget cutting, the high-income budget cutting preferences have a substantial negative effect. That's what you'd expect. The more enthusiastic these affluent people are about cutting budgets, the less social spending is likely to increase. And if anything, the estimated impact of low-income budget cutting preferences has the wrong sign, but it's not a very statistically reliable estimate. Then when we turn to the general measure of welfare state support with the two different data sets, you see kind of similar estimates in both cases. High-income welfare state support has a pretty strong positive impact on subsequent spending changes, whereas low-income welfare state support, if anything, again, has a negative impact on policy outcomes. I won't go into this in detail at all, except to say that what I'm doing here is to translate the regression analyses into a more theoretical structure that might capture something about how policymakers are actually making decisions. First of all, there's some possibility of responsiveness to public opinion. That's captured by this responsiveness measure. Then there's a influence ratio, the low-income influence ratio, which measures the relative impact of low-income people's preferences by comparison with high-income people's preferences. If that ratio was 1.0, that would indicate political equality, that everyone's preferences were being weighted equally. If it was 0, it would mean that low-income preferences didn't matter at all. And you see here, in fact, overall, a pretty strong negative effect, meaning that the more support low-income people express for the welfare state, the less they actually get. Then there are these other variables that policymakers are supposed to be taking into account, the dependency ratio and GDP. All of that stuff inside the, a couple more, country fixed effects included here, and also the current spending level, which I'm thinking of as being a constraint. So I'm imagining that the desired level of spending, which is based on all of these factors, including public opinion, is compared with the current level of spending. If the current level of spending is too low, then there's a impetus for policymakers to increase spending. If the current level of spending is too high, then there's an impetus for policymakers to reduce spending relative to where it is now. And this equilibration rate is just an estimate of how much of the disparity between the desired level of spending and the actual level of spending actually gets reduced over the course of the subsequent 2 years. So whatever that gap is between the ideal level of spending, taking into account public opinion and these other factors, and the current level of spending, about 18 or 20% of it will be reduced over the course of the next 2 years by shifts in policy. And then I'm accounting separately at the bottom for what I call automatic stabilizers. These are short-term changes in GDP and unemployment over the 2 years between when the survey occurred and when the policy changes are actually being measured, since in most of these countries there are automatic stabilizers that would produce increases in spending when the economy goes down and unemployment goes up, even if the policymakers aren't making any specific policy choices to produce those results. Okay, so this example estimate is very bad for low-income people. And it has implications. As I showed you, those implications depend not only on the disparities in responsiveness to affluent and poor people, but also on the difference in their preferences. Since if they had identical preferences, it wouldn't really matter which policymakers were responding to. But since they don't, especially in the cases where the gap in preferences between high and low income people is large, you see substantial estimated reductions in the effective demand for social spending due to these biases in responsiveness. In most countries, they're on the order of 10 or 15%, which is to say, social spending would be 10 or 15% higher if policymakers were responding to the preferences of low-income people to the same extent that they respond to the preferences of high-income people. So now to turn back to my question about why we see these disparities in US and now in other places as well. I want to look at a variety of possible explanatory factors at the national level, things that might account for greater or lesser disparities in responsiveness, differences in political cultures and political institutions and political economies, by looking at the same analyses but for subsets of my countries and years that are defined by differences in institutions or political cultures. So here's an example. Looking at 3 different subsets of the overall set of democracies. Established democracies are ones that have been functioning as democratic systems for at least 20 years, most but not all. You see the low income influence ratio is, if anything, an even larger negative number in those cases. Social democracies are the ones that have often been defined in the comparative politics literature as being socially oriented and in most cases having much larger welfare states. whereas liberal democracies are the Anglo-American countries mostly that have tended to have less well-developed welfare states. You can see in both of those cases there's pretty substantial negative impact of low-income people's preferences by comparison with high-income people's preferences. What about political institutions? Well, you can look at federalized or centralized systems. You can look at systems that operate by proportional representation or plurality rules. In all of those cases, again, low-income people's preferences have no positive impact on policy outcomes. Different levels of economic development. Look at the most affluent countries, the least affluent countries, the most economically unequal, the least economically unequal. In every one of those subsets, again, we're getting negative estimates of the impact of low-income preferences. And so some tentative conclusions here. First, there are substantial and persistent shortfalls in social spending relative to public demand, whether it's measured directly in terms of these questions about increasing or decreasing spending on specific social programs, or measured indirectly in terms of people's responses to shifts in spending. Social expenditures are correlated with preferences, but only modestly responsive to those preferences. And the responsiveness is largely or wholly limited to affluent citizens, and that reduces the effective demand for social spending by about 10 or 15% on average. And maybe most surprisingly, we observe essentially similar patterns regardless of the political cultures and the political institutions and the political economies of these various countries. Thank you.
Voting patterns, and if that's an explanation on it. So, like, do the rich vote for, and who do they vote for? Does that matter? And also on the taxation side of things, is it that people want more spending, but they don't want the same amount of taxes, and that's why effective demand and that gap is induced?
Certainly, the incoherence of public preferences accounts for part of the failure of responsiveness of policymakers to these preferences. I've done a fair amount of looking at what might be called the quality of the preferences of people at the top and bottom of the income distribution, and the differences seem to be less than is often imagined. Even in these economic domains, you don't, for example, see a much greater level of consistency between the preferences expressed in response to different questions by people at the top of the income distribution than people at the bottom. Gillens, in his book, repeated the analysis that he'd done looking at different income levels by comparing responsiveness to the preferences of people at various education levels. You might think if what we were capturing was something about the quality of people's opinions, that those would be more strongly correlated with education levels than with income levels. But it turns out that the disparities that he observed with respect to income differences don't really appear very much at all with respect to educational differences. So it does seem to have to do specifically with income rather than other aspects of these people's preferences that policymakers might conceivably be taking into account. Turnout, I mean, there are in most places some disparities in turnout between affluent and poor people. They're especially strong in the US, much weaker in a lot of these places. And one of the analyses that I haven't done but intend to do is to compare more systematically places with high levels of turnout and places with low levels of turnout. In my own work on the US, I've looked at disparities in responsiveness to different income levels holding constant turnout, that is, including an additional factor that captures whether the individual citizen turned out to vote, and that seemed not to make much difference and didn't affect these disparities in responsiveness. So my guess is that that's not really an important factor that would explain the overall patterns here either.
Guardian Casper had a piece on the causes of populism in which he made the case that these are socioeconomic causes, very much in line with what you say empirically, and that instead we should be focusing on these and not on anti-immigration, turn to the right sort of culturalist attempts to win over the working class. So he finds that in fact people are thirsty for more of a socio-economic approach, kind of Ocasio-Cortez Does that seem to align with what you might be thinking about populism, if you are thinking about populism?
I actually have been thinking about populism lately and have written a little bit about it. There is a strong relationship between ideological positions and support for at least right-wing populism, but there's also a lot of support for the idea that these sentiments have to do with attitudes toward immigrants and attitudes toward the EU and attitudes toward the political system, political disaffection, economic disaffection. Surprisingly, that level of sentiment, the kind of background level of attitudes that might conduce to supporting populist parties across Europe as a whole has changed virtually not at all over the past 15 or 20 years. So we have this idea that there's a wave of populism, and at least in some countries in terms of actual voting patterns, that does seem to be the case. But in terms of the level of sentiment for that would be supportive of populism, the metaphor that I use is that it's not a wave, it's a reservoir, that in almost all countries at almost all times there's a fair amount of this kind of sentiment, and what's changed recently is the willingness or ability of political elites to appeal to it in particular places. And indeed, if you look across countries at the level of right-wing populist sentiment as measured by attitudes toward immigration and social programs and the EU and distrust of political elites, and the success of right-wing populist parties, the correlation is very weak, which I take to be an indication that the relevant action is really more at the elite level than at the level of the masses. There are also in these surveys some questions specifically about the responsiveness of political elites to the preferences of ordinary people or to people like you. You might think that if it was unhappiness about these disparities in responsiveness that were driving the phenomenon, that you'd see a pretty strong association between those kinds of expressions of specific frustration with political responsiveness and support for right-wing parties, and it doesn't seem to be there at all. Once you take these other factors into account, the relationship between that specific frustration and a tendency to express support for right-wing populist parties is almost completely non-existent. So people may have good reason to be frustrated and unhappy about these patterns, but they don't seem to be, or at least they don't seem to be translating it into that particular kind of concrete political opposition.
When you compared the preferences for social spending of the low-income people and the high-income people, it seemed to me that both dimensions, or on both axes, the indicator was positive, right? So there is no, not even among affluent people is there a desire to spend less. Isn't that also a bit surprising?
On average across these programs.
Yeah, but still, I mean, you could argue that very affluent people would actually want to spend effectively less, right? And the other question was, so it never goes below 50, even among high-income people.
Right. Remember, these estimates of the top and bottom are based on a linear extrapolation over the whole population. So there might be people at the very top who actually would prefer less spending. But even with pretty large samples, the set of people that you can get at the very top is so small that you can't really tell reliably. Along with some colleagues a few years ago, I did a kind of pilot study of very affluent people in the US, multimillionaires, and it did appear in that case that they pretty commonly were opposed to increases in social spending of various kinds. So there is some fraction at the very top that probably would look different than this, but in a general population survey, the best estimate you can get is that the affluent people are just less enthusiastic about increasing. And you do, if you look at the, let's see what the vertical dimension here is the real increase in social spending over a 2-year period. You can see that there are almost no negative values there either. So the overall desire to increase spending is met in some sense by an overall tendency to increase spending, even in real per capita terms in all these places. So there's a lot of discussion about austerity in social welfare systems, more discussion than there is actual austerity.
Yeah, let's go about the concept of responsiveness. And it strikes me that as a kind of political concept is a bit kind of naive with respect to governments as to why you would expect them always to be responsive. Because in a sense, responsive may not necessarily help you if you kind of change your kind of course every time the public change their opinion. That might not necessarily get you re-elected. And in fact, governments are often quite strategic in terms of what they do. They're actually able to influence the public opinion. So maybe, I mean, I suppose what this is about, and it may not necessarily affect the argument which you want to pose, but it's about the kind of causal, the direction of the causal arrow. I mean, I think what you're saying implies it goes from the various sections of the population to policy, but what if policymakers were seeking to kind of influence different parts of public opinion, and maybe it's more congruence between the kind of policymakers and the rich, possibly in terms of the kind of macro economy, the kind of larger political economy of kind of policy choices. So, which is a way of saying that actually underneath this kind of idea of naive responsiveness is a kind of quite a lot of kind of causal arrows which belie the kind of correlations, if that makes sense.
There certainly is a lot of that going on. I mean, policymakers are often trying to influence citizens' views. I think mechanically in this particular kind of analysis, that's probably less of a concern because of the timing of the surveys relative to the subsequent policy shifts. So the survey is conducted and then we're looking at changes in policy over the next 2 years. So it doesn't seem likely that the subsequent changes in policy are influencing the preferences that are expressed at time t. But certainly over the longer run, political cultures involve lots of attempts to justify particular kinds of policy in this domain and others. So I think it's important that there's a lot of that going on. As a normative matter, I should have said earlier that I think this is helpful as a test of equality and not as a judgment about the effectiveness of policymaking. Most understandings of democracy attach considerable importance to responsiveness in some general sense. We don't expect policymaking to be entirely divorced from the preferences of citizens, but at the same time, I think relatively few of us would be enthusiastic about a system in which policymakers simply translated citizens' preferences into policy in this or other areas. This is probably an area where your specific concern about constantly adjusting policies in response to citizens' preferences would not be such a major one, because at the margin you can increase or decrease spending in a way that you can't, make a decision to get in or out of the European Union quite as easily. But nonetheless, I think it's important to realize that this is not, a hand-wringing exercise about the unresponsiveness of policymakers to citizens' preferences, but rather a kind of indication that if we're going to take that basis of evaluating democracy seriously at all, almost any understanding of democracy would suggest that there should be roughly equivalent responsiveness to the preferences of affluent people and poor people. And the fact that we observe such alarming disparities, at least insofar as we can tell from these kinds of analyses, seems to me to be a kind of reductio ad absurdum of the kind of general notion that democracy is about satisfying citizens' preferences. Doesn't seem to work that way.
Yes, I wondered if you'd looked at responsiveness over a longer time period than just 2 years after the... And I suppose what I just have in the back of my mind somehow is perhaps a naive view that policy doesn't change very much in the course of 2 years. The poor would like to see big policy changes, the rich would like to see small policy changes, and so if policy is just slow to change, then it'll appear to be more responsive to those who want to see less change. But it's the slowness of
I have an analysis that parallels this one that looks 5 years out from the time the survey was conducted, and the results look very similar to the ones here. But as a kind of general matter, going this way, I think these kind of patterns pretty well rule out the idea that it's just that the system is slow moving, because here we're observing, over a period of 20 years, and the gaps between what people say they want and what they're getting are actually increasing over that period in most places rather than decreasing. So I don't think it's just the speed of adjustment that's the issue.
Thanks so much for the presentation. I'm really glad you're kind of getting out of the sort of more isolated Americanist approach to this question and thinking more broadly. I think that... Yeah, so I guess my question is following the earlier one regarding the causal error, the causal relationship here. So do you think there is a possibility that the wealthy might just be more attuned to what is seen as the responsible set of policies that are more likely to happen, right? Just because of the fact that they're reading more, they're more informed, they're more in connection with sort of what are the serious options on the table, and then more broadly getting to this point of responsibility. I mean, Peter Merritt talked about responsiveness versus responsibility. You are only focusing on responsiveness. Do you think that any of this gap could be explained by certain just needs for macroeconomic decision making, limits to how big the welfare state could be and still have a strong economy? It's interesting that even in social democratic countries that are spending 50 and 55% of GDP from the government, including 35% on social expenditures, that you still see it there. And that gets to my final question is, has there ever been a time where this gap hasn't existed? I mean, was there, have you looked at 60s, 70s, 80s, 1990s data? And if this is a fairly consistent pattern across all democracies and across most time, what does this tell us? Are we just kind of stuck, or maybe we need to have new theories of the meaningfulness of democracy?
I'm in favor of new theories of the meaningfulness of democracy. A colleague and I published a book a few years ago called Democracy for Realists that was intended to try to pare away some of what we called the folk theory notions about the way democracy operates, and to come up with a, not in any way very systematic or theoretical, but a more realistic understanding of the way democratic processes actually seem to operate. In this particular domain, I guess it seems kind of natural to think that in some sense affluent people might have more sensible preferences. I can tell you that looking at other policy areas where it's not obviously the case that they would, you see similar kinds of patterns. For example, the looking that I've done at the issue of abortion in the US produces patterns that are pretty similar to these. Gillen's 1,800 questions focus on all sorts of policy areas, some of which are economic policy and others of which are not. And he finds some variation across domains in terms of the disparities, but the basic picture is pretty similar across those different areas. So I don't think it's reasonableness in any direct sense, but there is a sense, I think, in which affluent people tend to be more tuned into the same kinds of political discourse and cultural considerations as policymakers themselves. And so one way to think about this is that in most democratic systems, even if they aspire to be very egalitarian, the elected officials tend to come from the affluent side of the economic spectrum. They tend to spend most of their time hanging out with affluent people. They tend to be listening to the same sources of information as affluent people. And so even if they weren't making any conscious attempt to respond to the preferences of affluent people, you might see a strong correlation for those kinds of sociological reasons. So I think that's a live hypothesis about what it is that's going on here that would help, I think, to account for the apparent uniformity of these patterns across a large set of cases. We don't really have much in the way of evidence from any era before the era that I'm talking about here, or for most other countries. Gillen's, in his analysis, his main analysis focused on 1980 to 2002, I think, 2000 maybe, and he was kind of taken aback by the results, and so he went back to look at the 1960s, which in the US is sometimes thought of as a kind of high point of democracy because a lot of the sorts of policies that most academics like were being implemented during that period. The Great Society programs, the increase in Medicare and education spending and so on. It turned out that in that period, the patterns of responsiveness looked very much the same as in the more recent period. What was happening was that there was a Democratic president and an overwhelmingly Democratic Congress who were doing the things that they thought were good for the country, in many cases without much in the way of specific public support. So a lot of these programs that the Johnson Congresses adopted that we now think of as being, the hallmarks of the Great Society were really not all that popular among ordinary American citizens. So they were consistent with a different view of democracy, but not with the naive responsiveness version of democracy.
So what to do? What to do then? I mean, two things. We have the economic crisis of 2007, 2008. Does that affect your data in any way, or does it all just go through that crisis? Now, take that as a question. But then, what to do? I mean, all the people who are answering to your questions have the same basic political power in the vote, but they don't have the same power in other resources. So the rich have much more of other resources to back up their vote with than do the poor. So what to do then? Would one answer be to look for ways to make the vote count more and other resources count less? I mean, does that make sense? If we have ways of doing it, would that be a response to the problem that you are seeing, that our political systems do not work very well in terms of unbiased responsiveness? And if so, how could that be done? Or your last comment that for a while there were Democratic presidents and Democratic Congresses in America. I mean, what matters is it who the politicians are that matters? And that once you have a certain category of politicians, it doesn't really matter very much while they are in power what the specific kind of demand from below is. So would then the sort of idea for what to do go in the direction of figuring out how to get the right kind of politicians into office?
Yes, first of all, about the economic crisis. These data stopped before the economic crisis, so I don't have any direct evidence about that. The analysis that I was talking about before about populism extended from 2002 to 2017, and so there it's possible to track people's preferences across the economic crisis, and consistent with some of the work that I and other people have done focusing specifically on the crisis, there's remarkably little response in public opinion. If you look at attitudes about immigration, for example, if anything, they're a little bit more favorable across Europe now than they were before the crisis. If you look at attitudes about the political system, they're really not that different. Even attitudes about the EU are really not very different now than they were before. There was a uptick in what the question is about satisfaction with how the economy is working in your country. There was an uptick in economic dissatisfaction, pretty short-lived, and now we're back to the levels from before the recession. So I think politically, the economic crisis has had remarkably little impact on public opinion. As to what to do, I think in principle your idea about increasing the relative importance of the vote makes sense, but I think it's hard to know how to do that in practice. There are so many ways for economic power to get translated into political power. I think the basic problem here is that we would like to think that we can somehow wall off the political system from the rest of society and operate under different rules in the political system, and that turns out to be more difficult than we'd like it to be. People who have economic power may have to find different ways or work harder to translate that economic power into political power in some systems than in others, but they do. And on your last point about the quality of the politicians, I take that to be immensely important. If you look at the patterns of roll call votes by members of the Senate that I described, the differences in responsiveness to affluent and poor people are at the margin after we take account of the differences in behavior between Republicans and Democrats, even if they represent exactly the same constituents or constituents with similar views. The Senate is convenient because there are two senators representing each state, so they literally have the same set of constituents. If one is a Republican and the other is a Democrat, their behavior will be vastly different, and that reflects the importance of partisanship in the current U.S. system, but more generally, I think, reflects the fact that politicians most of the time are trying to do what they think is good for the country. And so understanding the ideologies of elite policymakers and why some policy options are considered unrespectable in certain periods and not in others, I think is immensely important to understand why we get the policies we do. So in the US, for example, I mean, Donald Trump has appealed to people with bad attitudes about immigrants. It's not like those people weren't there before. In fact, there are fewer people with anti-immigrant attitudes in the US now than there were 10 years ago or 20 years ago. But the political elites on both sides of the party divide for a long time were pretty systematically trying to repress that issue and not give expression to that particular public impulse, whereas Trump has come along and given it voice and given it credibility that it didn't have before. That's immensely important.
I wonder if this then is an argument for direct democracy. I mean, we've just had an experiment in direct democracy in Britain with the European referendum, and that's raised a huge crisis, if you like, about deliverability of that policy. So is this then, why don't we just have direct democracy and maybe we'd get a more responsive system?
I think you probably would get a more responsive system in some naive sense. I don't know that anyone thinks that would be a good thing. In places where it's been tried, it's often produced kind of scary results. And so, again, maybe that's a basis for thinking that responsiveness as a standard is not a good idea normatively in the first place. It does probably produce more egalitarian responsiveness than a system of representation does, although you still have elites who are framing the questions. And so I wouldn't say that it's automatically or mechanically an egalitarian system, but it probably would be more egalitarian than the system that I've described. Not one to my liking in spite of that.
So I've got two general concerns about the way that these studies often operate. The first is that the data aren't always reliable enough to carry the weight that the analysis puts on them. So I think a striking example of this is the McDonald and Budge book, where they make a lot of very risky assumptions to come out with figures for proportional representation versus plurality systems, which are fairly close, but they think that the differences are large, and I just think the numbers are not accurate enough. So the first question would be, what do you think the error bars are around your estimates here, and do you think they're sufficiently great to cast out on some of these findings? Then the second question is about the mechanism. So my suspicion is that governments are not trying to work out where the median voter is, or some aggregate figure of what people want in terms of spending to go up or down. They're thinking about particular groups of people, geographically and or class and or in terms of party ID. Who can they convince? And those things have changed over time. Politicians have got more sophisticated in their campaigners at working out what groups of people to target, what groups of people to listen to. So it's probably not a surprise that governments aren't responsive to the population as a whole or to an aggregate figure as a whole. It would be really interesting to find out what groups of people they're focusing on. And almost by definition, they will not be the people at the very bottom who will tend to either vote for the left-wing party or not vote at all. They'll be the floaters, the people in the middle. And I suspect those people have more influence. It would be really interesting to find out how responsive governments are to those groups of people and how those vary between different kinds of political system, electoral system, and so on.
Yeah, I mean, that's difficult to do. My sense for the U.S. is that they're not very responsive to those people either. I have a paper that looks at 30 years, I guess, of data tracking the preferences of the median voter in your sense on a variety of different policies, and then tracking the positions of Republican and Democratic presidential candidates. And they're all over the place, but the Democrats are always way to the left and the Republicans are always way to the right of where the supposedly pivotal voters are at any given moment. I think the idea that politicians are constantly, carefully figuring out who it is that they have to respond to in order to get reelected is way overblown. As for the precision of the estimates, you can see something here about the little numbers in parentheses under each of the estimates is the standard error. The kind of most uncertain one, relatively speaking here, is probably the overall responsiveness of any sort to public opinion. As I showed you in the pictures at the beginning, there does seem to be some relationship there, but it becomes pretty weak once you begin to take these other things into account. But once you take this estimate of responsiveness, the relative influence of low-income people by comparison with high-income people is very precise statistically. Here's a t-statistic of 3 or 4 to even get to 0, which would mean that their preferences had no effect, and t-statistic of 7 or 8 to get to the benchmark of egalitarian responsiveness to poor people relative to rich people.
Could I just go one stage back? So the figure that I'm interested in uncertainty about is each country's indicator of how close the government is to the people. So do you think, let's say the figure is 25, do you think that it's likely to be somewhere between 20 and 30 or between 24 and 26? How accurate do you think those initial data are?
It depends on the country, because these surveys are conducted by different national survey organizations in different countries. So there is some variability there, but that variability is pretty small relative to the other things that are going on. Once you then subset into income groups and stuff like that, then it becomes a little bit dicier, and some of the, go back to the correlations here. If all of these observations fell completely on the 45-degree line, or for that matter on any diagonal line, we wouldn't have any hope of estimating the differential impact of different people's preferences. So in effect, it's the scatter in these data that provides the leverage for doing a statistical analysis. And that implies that, if you don't have enough data, or if you have a policy area where you can predict pretty well people at the top from people at the bottom in the same country, or vice versa, that you're not going to be able to generate much leverage for doing these kinds of analyses. And so I take all of that to heart. The actual estimates here are varying on the order of maybe a few points on this scale, but probably even less than that. So I don't think it's a big issue with this kind of analysis. But to do it more detail, for example, what you would like to do is to look at individual countries with lots of policies, the way Gillen's does for the US, but that's very hard in most places. There have been a couple studies that attempt to replicate his work in other countries. There's one in Germany and one in Sweden, both of which, sound to many Europeans at least like places that are likely to be a lot more egalitarian than the US. Nevertheless, those analyses have produced results that look pretty similar to his in terms of the apparent influence of affluent and poor people.
I have a question, maybe just a guess. Because responsiveness is a marginal concept, and I have a guess that is it possible that in some specific, because your research is researching affluent societies, and in these societies, I guess, generally speaking, its social development and its welfare system, government spending has satisfied most people's demands. So can I guess that in certain period or in certain time, not in marginal meaning, but in general meaning, this democratic system has some responsiveness to most people's demands. Then, in your research, this is just research the marginal responsiveness to this whole system. My guess, maybe it can explain why the democracy is so good or so stable, or it at least has some responsiveness to most people's demands. Or maybe this is just a guess.
Yeah, it would be interesting to do the same kind of analysis for non-democratic systems. My suspicion actually is different than yours. It's that the results wouldn't look all that different. Because even non-democratic systems have political constraints and have to, keep the peace as best they can. If you can see it here. There are some instances here in which you're seeing very substantial changes in policy over a relatively short period of time. So it's not like these systems are so stable either with respect to preferences or with respect to policy outcomes that you wouldn't be able to observe responsiveness to the preferences of poor people if it was actually going on. So I don't think that's right, but you may be right that there's some underlying sense in which the systems are at least sufficiently responsive to be able to work. It's hard to find evidence of that. I showed one of the analyses that limited the analysis to what I called stable democracies, the ones that had been operating as democracies for 20 years or something like that. And the set of new democracies in this data set isn't sufficiently large that I could look at that subset separately, but just eyeballing it, it doesn't look like the countries that have only been democracies for a short period of time look very different in terms of the patterns of responsiveness. But it would be interesting. In the ISSP data, we don't have much variation in countries beyond the ones that I've included. But for the World Values Survey, obviously they have a lot of additional countries that aren't democracies, and so one could do this kind of analysis with those places, at least insofar as you're willing to take survey data from those kinds of places as indicative of citizens' real preferences and see what the patterns of responsiveness seem to be. Again, there are difficulties with measuring the policy outcomes in those places as well, so I'm not sure how far you'd get, but in principle it would be interesting to make that comparison.
I mean, that the problem here is not that elites are not responsive to the poor. The problem is that they are responsive to the rich. I mean, a good democratic political system should churn out policies that are fair compromises between what different people in the population want, with the result that no one should be satisfied. I mean, I know it. Try to think of better functioning political systems. It seems to me that the one issue here is to block out the influence of the rich, what you call responsiveness to the rich, not to engage in direct democracy or anything to increase the influence of those who do not have the influence to make themselves responded to, but to have a fair non-responsiveness to all groups in the population.
Well, then the issue is, how do you design a system that's going to be fair if it's not responding to anybody, right?
Responding to everybody in such a way that everybody's dissatisfied at the end.
Well, but this isn't a measure of whether people are satisfied. It's a measure of whether policy moves when their preferences move. So I think the benchmark that you're suggesting would imply that you'd have equal responsiveness to people across the income distribution, wouldn't it? So that would be the 1.0, and my estimate is minus 0.8 or whatever it is. So then there's a second question, which is, if we're not going to have responsiveness to the poor, would it be better not to have responsiveness to the rich either? I don't know the answer to that normatively. I suppose it depends on what policy area you're talking about and what you think of the preferences of rich people. But in principle, it's not obvious to me how to design that kind of system either.
Okay, everybody, thanks very much for the questions, and thanks very much for coming along this evening. We do have a reception in room 4.03 if you'd like to join us, perhaps to ask more questions or just to sort of enjoy the conversation. But I'd really just like to, as well as thanking you for coming, thanking our speaker this evening, Larry Bartels, who I think has given us an incredible amount of food for thought with that presentation and the answer to the question. So thank you very much, Larry.
Thank you.